Hi everyone, welcome to another BAPT in Conversation webinar. I'm Richard Owen, current Treasurer and a Trustee of the BAPT, that's the British Association for Psychological Type. We're a charity member organisation. We exist to help spread knowledge and best practice with psychological type. We've got an annual conference coming up this April again, 2023. And one of the keynotes is being given by Joel and Antonia, who I'm interviewing today. We're going to talk to them a little bit about the topic of their presentation, which is generations of people who are involved with psychological type. So welcome, Joel and Antonia. How are you doing?
Thank you. We're doing great.
Awesome to be here. Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, so you are Joel and Antonia, and together you are Personality Hacker. Is that right?
Yeah. We lead Personality Hacker. We have a full team of people that also work with us, other teachers and trainers and other people that are on our team. But primarily, we're kind of the figurehead, the people that are usually in front of the camera, talking about what we do and sharing and spreading messages. Yeah.
Yeah. So Personality Hacker, tell me about what that is now. Currently, what does it do?
We're looking for ways to make personality types come alive in people's lifestyle, in their real day-to-day. Like there's all this conversation across all generations, across all of this. And some people have found business application, some people have found like personal growth application. And that's the key word, is application. Anytime that we can find a way to apply this in a real way, something that actually changes how we move through the world. One thing we often talk to our students and clients about is like true learning. If you really truly learn something, you're going to have behavior change. And so we're really trying to find, how can this come alive for people? How can they make this very much a part of their day-to-day experience?
Yeah. And so because that's our goal is to make it so that people are able to use what we think is a very powerful model in their day-to-day life, to make better choices, to figure out, the sort of their direction. Sometimes it can even help people understand their purpose, right? It can be sort of game changing. Because of that, then we publish personal growth programs, we run live events, we do coaching. We very much focus primarily on the personal growth application of it, but we do dabble in the business side from time to time as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so does that mean consulting, going out to companies?
Yes.
Yeah. Which
is kind of crazy, Richard. A name like Personality Hacker. You try to work with a Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company here in the United States, it's like, this word hacker, what is this all about? Like maybe the name could have been a little bit more dialed in for corporate, but when we show up and we deliver great value, they're like, okay, we get it. We understand. That's cool.
Yeah. So you're looking for applications, helping people grow and change. I mean, what drove that for you to get into this business? What change and impact did this stuff have on your lives in the first place?
Good question.
Talk about it?
Yeah. So I have ENTP preferences. I've always been both social and awkward at the same time. And so my mom, both social and awkward. My mom, who has INFJ preferences, had the book, Please Understand Me. And I don't know how into it she got, but around 14 years old, I routinely stole books out of her library. She read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. And so I'd go steal fantasy books out of her library. And I ran into the Please Understand Me book. And so I read it, I consumed it. And at the time, I was too young to really, understand the impact of all of it, but I knew that there was something important there. And it got embedded into my brain. And I just sort of saw everything through the lens of this model. It might have been actually the first mental model I ran across. And now I realize I have an almost endless appetite for mental models and systems, but I didn't know that at the time. And so it was the first real system I ran across to help systemize things like, why are people different? And why am I so awkward? And how do I understand myself and other people to interface with them? Which is a lot more sophisticated language I'm using now than I did at the time at 14. But it got it was like a mind worm that got embedded in my brain. And then quite a bit later, after I was, and I ran into other people, I had friends that were sort of into it, and we just talked casually, and we thought we knew what we were talking about, and we just typed everybody. All of it was probably wrong. But at a certain point, I ran into Carl Jung's cognitive functions. And at that point, I felt like I had really, like the real power of the system got unlocked for me. And so that became an even more important mental model at the same time that I was consuming all these other mental models. And so it helped reframe how I saw people, helped reframe how I saw myself. I was able to make much better decisions. And so it just became sort of a way that I experienced life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My story is a little bit more closer to many of our students, our clients, our audience. I was in a transition moment when personality types became very real to me, in that I had this very strong relationship with my family and faith background. And I had, not knowing that I had, so I had ENFP preferences, but at the time I didn't realize that I had been outsourcing my own sovereignty and authority in my life to my faith background, my parents, my family, external systems. And I was having a lot of suffering. I was going through a terrible divorce at the time. It was a really traumatic time in my life when personality types, in particular the cognitive functions and some of the growth things that we teach now, I was awakened to, going, oh, you mean I need to bring the authority of my life in-house? Like, I need to be the one that's sovereign, making my own decisions. Yes, I can still choose to have a faith background or to have a family orientation, that, my family of origins orientation, all that. But unless I make it my own and it's my own inner authority, I'm always going to be fighting against that outside of myself. And so personality types and understanding the cognitive functions and the wiring of my mind helped me reclaim more of my sovereign self. And that transition point was a spark to say, well, if I have that experience, I bet a lot of other people are going through a transition moment. They're in a reset moment. They're trying to understand why they've done it. It may not be the authority thing that I had to deal with, but something they're probably struggling with or trying to figure out as they're in that transition. And so that was where the insight came to go, that would be something we could really help people go through, understanding how personality types as a ballast can help some of those transitory moments in someone's life, no matter where they are, whether they're starting out in life, right out of university, or their midlife, changing something, or even later life, reviewing and trying to create meaning for, okay, what did all this mean? Where am I going with all of that? So that was what made type come alive for me personally.
I didn't know we were going to that level of real. So
that's interesting. Yeah, they're both very powerful sort of changing experiences through understanding yourself with this stuff.
Yeah.
Where do you think Joel and Antonia would be now if it wasn't for that experience? What jobs would you be doing potentially? What life path might you have followed in that alternate reality?
Yeah,
I'd be a movie director.
Yeah,
probably, or media. I'd be a media producer.
Well, I didn't know you were going to go that level of real faith backgrounds and all that stuff, because I would have really actually said, if I was going to talk about the nitty gritty, is that I was going through a very similar time period of transition away from my faith background, but I was raised in what I would call a cult. And so I was actually reprogramming myself. Wow. And when I said I consumed all of these systems, it was actually when I left my religion of origin, I had to reprogram my entire mind, because, when you are raised in a cult, that's everything, right? That's the entire infrastructure of your minds. And so all of these systems ended up becoming my new ballast, and type was one of them. And so I think it ended up becoming so embedded inside that I couldn't not think about it in those terms. Yeah. So what would I be doing if I wasn't doing this? Probably just sort of floating. Who knows? Actually, I have absolutely no idea.
That's a hard question.
It is an alternate reality of what I would be doing. Probably
it's like an INTJ question, isn't it? Like, how would your life have gone different? And you're like, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. But I am incredibly lucky that it got me here. Because then I get to talk about the thing that was so powerful for me. So yeah.
And you've both mentioned what they call the cognitive functions, but I mean, I guess it was Jung's original types. His 8 types. Yeah. Which you could say 8 types of mental processing or psychological systems. So is that kind of the basis of the model as you see it? For type, is it grounded in the 8 function model approach?
Oh, more so now than ever. I mean, we started out talking about how do you take your 4 letters and you find your cognitive functions, which has been great. I mean, it's been with the people that we help understand this, the richness, the depth, people that have dismissed personality types, particularly Myers-Briggs, often when you show them the cognitive functions, they're like, oh, I should have dismissed that. There's so much power. There's so much usefulness here. To the point where now, I'll have to tell you, Richard, we're actually starting to talk about it almost starting with the cognitive functions, not the 4 letters. Mm-hmm. So the way we articulate to people now is, often we'll say there are 8 realities or 8 energies of life we have to engage with. You know, all of us have to be in the present moment, for example, extroverted sensing, or what we call it sensation here, personality, but extroverted sensing, technical name, right? We all have to be in the present moment. All of us have to have a tether to the past and where we've come from. So we all have introverted sensing, right? And we go through all the functions. We talk about, you're wired in your personality to pay attention to 2 of those primarily. That's really your focus, and your attention is going to be there. But what about all the other areas of life that you're not necessarily wired for? And we're starting to message it this way, and people are starting to awaken to this, to go, oh, okay, so that's what my personality type is attuning to. It's to tell me what energies or realities of life that I'm going to be most attuned to. I'm going to feel like a fish in water. It's going to be very natural to me. And then all the other areas that, man, that no wonder that area of life is a struggle for me. I'm not wired to attune to that. And we start to see our clients, students, and audience to start to take to this. So you're talking to us right now in a transition moment of us trying to put more emphasis of talking about it this way. And we have a feeling like this is going to unlock a reality for people, a very experiential reality for people that may be coming at it just from the Myers-Briggs 4 letters. It doesn't access as quickly, I guess is what I would say. Does that make sense what I'm saying, by the way? Coming at
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I call myself an 8-function fundamentalist, and see that as the actual reality that we're talking about that can be experienced. And that's what you're talking about, the experiential moment or state, as you would call it in psychological terms. Which, you know, and when that state is dominated by a particular lens on reality, you can then grasp it, and you can say, this is happening.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of this also, a couple of years ago, a few years ago, you know, I'd read psychological types and got into a little bit of Jung's work, but it was more sort of 1 degree of separation, and oh, this is the source material, so I should be familiar with it, etc. But then I hit midlife, which is something that Carl Jung is surprisingly, he's one of the best resources on midlife research at this point, or talking about it and discussing what happens, basically of anybody. I mean, there's some other research on midlife, but not nearly as much, because the assumption is that your development is complete at that point.
Isn't Eric Erickson kind of just drops off? After
Eric Erickson, who's like talks about development. He just, but that, of course, he focused on childhood up to, like basically early adulthood. But there's so many changes that happen at midlife, and Jung's work was some of the best resource. So I started diving way down the Carl Jung, rabbit hole in this concept of midlife. And I think saturating myself in his work gave me a slightly different perspective on type in general, because you mentioned 8-function fundamentals, and that's the basis for everything. But I think a big piece of it too is that Joel mentioned that these are like kind of slices of reality, and that we come pre-wired to be focused on some of these and not others. And there were multiple things that came out of this sort of, I could call it a midlife crisis, but I mean like more like midlife, just awareness and awakening. Yeah. Is that I am pre-wired to be hyper-focused on certain elements, and I'm going to identify with that. Like, take, for example, with somebody with ENTP preferences, I'm going to be hyper-focused on extroverted intuition and anything that lives in the realm of possibilities and disruptions and patterns that I can experience, and, like engaging with the world. Whatever is like a new system or new way of thinking, brainstorming, all of that's going to feel like almost like I have ownership over it. I'm going to feel like that's mine. And I thought, well, if it's mine in sense of like the privilege of I get to be the owner of that, then there's also going to be a sense of responsibility that comes with it. And then it didn't take too long for me to go from the word responsibility to stewardship. And so there's a piece of this where I don't just have ENTP preferences. I am a steward of extroverted intuition. And I am a steward, following that same logic, of introverted thinking. So that means that it's my responsibility to represent those functions as best as I can, right? To represent them to the world in the best way possible. But then as I was doing this midlife research, Jung talks a lot about individuation and integrating the shadow. And there's a lot of Jungian, analysts that talk about how the 4th function is sort of the beginning of the shadow. And so integrating that 4th function is really important. And so it really gave me a sense of sort of responsibility of what I bring to the world, while at the same time becoming the best version of myself. And Jung's work is sort of the pathway to all of that. Like, he warns a lot about one-sidedness, and it's really easy to become one-sided, particularly if you're not doing that Jungian shadow work. So not to get too much in the weeds, which I have already done, which is the thing I do. But there's so much richness in there around how we can become the best version of ourselves, so much richness around how we can optimize this time period, particularly midlife, which is the time period that I'm in order to make sure that, you know, if there's like a fork in the road of one-sidedness, which you end up at the end of your life sort of becoming almost like a cardboard cutout version of yourself at that point, right? Like you're just more of what you've been the whole time, and you're just doubling down on being that thing. And then the other path is individuation, which is taking these parts of who we are and integrating them into ourselves and becoming more seasoned and truly having wisdom. If that's like sort of if that's stretching before me, I'm like, I think I want to go with the path of individuation. So taking all of those ideas and then now paring them down to a personality type based business, which is like, people are like, just tell me what it means to be an INTJ, right? Which is usually, it has to start out very accessible, like a little description so that people can sort of understand what this means. And then how do you take it from a place where you start out with almost like a coloring book version of type, which is, you know, hard lines and not a lot of detail, and then smuggle in all of these ideas about personal growth and development and becoming the best version of yourself and stewardship over your functions and the path of individuation and all that stuff. How do you create a cookie crumb trail where we go from this coloring book version of type into something that looks more like Van Gogh, right? Which is like, where are the hard lines? I don't know. It's just a merging of colors with each other, and it's so much more nuanced. And so that's a big part of what we do all the time is go, okay, how do we get people to this place, but start out at an accessible application, action-based beginning where it's not being pedantic about theory and arguing about who has the right, you know, who has the right definition of extroverted thinking or whatever. But how do we take somebody who's using this function and then get them into a place of action, get them into a place of experience, understanding the relationship to all of this, and eventually getting to a place where they're like, oh, this is actually legitimately changing my life. This is actually altering my decisions. This is helping me find not just myself, but my purpose. Yeah. This is helping me become more Jung's version of individuated. Yeah. And so our business is like a constant and perpetual question of how do we take people along that path? And not everybody goes the complete path, right? Some people start out there and then that's all they wanted. And then some people go a little further and that's all they wanted. And that's totally fine. But it's almost like it's like a siren call for anybody who wants to use it in that, that original intent that Jung had of individuation. How do we play the fiddle long enough to get people to that point where they're like, oh, I'm like a totally changed person now and a completely different version of myself. Mm-hmm. Did I track, by the way?
That's okay. Cool. Yeah. So what I'm thinking, what you're saying about the coloring book version leading into gradually something more complex. I struggle with that a lot myself to, I kind of don't want to go there. I'm like, we're going to do the intellectual version and people have to up their game and join us here. Like, right. I don't want to go that. I don't want to do the simple, but I know how important it is to be accessible. And I can see why that takes a different kind of skill actually to do that. And yet know that you're leading it to where you want it to be in complexity terms. So, I mean, I've got a good sense from that of what you're kind of, what's driving you, what sort of, where you've come from studying Jung, and what other background have you got, you guys, in terms of like, that's feeding into your work here, like in terms of coaching, counseling, other kind of helping profession stuff that you've gathered along the way?
Yeah. So some of the other intangibles that factor into this, one of the things I think that we also are really focused on is bringing a fun, I would say, element to the experiential part of it. In other words, I don't have an interest in being super academically focused in anything. I'm getting to a point here. I was raised, so my parents both run a youth camp. So I was raised at a summer camp my whole life, working with teenagers and youth, both as a child myself through my teenage and youth years, and then as an adult. I helped contribute to that. And so I think a lot of what we do, I always have this perspective. It's like a lot of times people, I've noticed this from working with youth for my whole life, even when we get to be adults, we love to access the fun, the openness, the lightheartedness, the expression that we have inside of us, the inner childlike youthfulness that we have. And so I think one of the things that contributes to a lot of what we do is we always try to infuse that spirit, because I don't care how old somebody is. I think everybody appreciates the permission and the context to let their hair down, to let go, to have fun, and to lean into a real experience that speaks to them, that can be fun, lighthearted, but also deep and connective. It means something more if you can add those other intangible elements to it. So from an education background, I have like a master's degree in leadership and like all the things. So a lot of that weaves into communication, weaves into that. Antonia's done coaching even before we had Persona. She's done like client work coaching that we bring into our work, right? So we've got a background in that. And I think that blend, that mixture, and we're also married, and it's just a whole different, it's a very complex system running, I think, that lets us deliver what we're delivering and create those experiences for people. So I don't know if that addresses exactly what you're asking, but I think that some of those things support the efforts that we're bringing forward.
Yeah. So your coaching and leadership sort of backgrounds, and that will feed into what you're doing, and of course life experience, being parents as well, I believe, that's a learning experience about type.
Better or worse.
Yeah. And before we get into the topic, I'm interested in, you guys come across so well, as personality hacker, as a kind of an entity that has a vision and a goal and a message. Where are the areas where you kind of have your own differences within ideas or theories?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, she's more like you, Richard. She's like, do I have to go over the basics? Do I have to? I mean, I think, Antonia, you're very willing to, but sometimes it's an obstruction to get to the real meat, the real heart of something. And she wants to get right. She's an NT, right? ENTP preferences. She wants to get to the deeper information. And sometimes I lean more toward, well, let me be a little bit more dumbed down. Let me make it more accessible for the average person. Maybe they don't know the type. And so I think that's a tension point probably in how we approach messaging this. And what's nice is because we're together, I can kind of play the role of a person maybe starting out and ask the questions if a new person was coming into it, like the questions they would ask on their behalf if they're not in a position to ask that. So I can kind of almost represent that. And Antonia can lean over and represent more of people that are coming more from the academic, or maybe they're very researched or very well versed in type. So I think we can approach it that way. I'm sure would you say that's a difference, by the way? Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, well, and I think that we do pretty well. I mean, I kind of teased before the recording started, we were talking, Richard, and I was like, yeah, we were arguing about it an hour ago. I think actually what's interesting is that because we both have ENP preferences, I mean, he definitely has more interest in business. Of course, for those of you who know cognitive functions, extrovert thinking is a function that he's very is accessible to him, and extroverted feeling is more my jam, right? And so he has more interest in sort of traditional marketing and business orientation, and I have more of an interest in sort of the like connecting with the audience and saying all the things that will help people understand the concepts. And so what's nice is that we feel like we cover multiple bases, but the one base we don't cover is what is inferior for both of us, right? Introverted sensing.
Double blind spot for us.
Yeah, that's right. And so we've had to learn to integrate that function together, right? Through a lot of trial and error. And I would say just like misery, just sheer unadulterated misery, which is, we always take on more than we can actually handle. We bite off more than we can chew. We're always fast paced. We're always like, we struggle to close loops. I have a huge sign that is my 2023 like motto that just says finish strong, right? Because neither of us want to finish anything ever, and we're immediately jumping to the next thing. And so now we all have all these like 90% projects that just hang there. And so,
well, the disagreement comes on how to address that probably.
Yes.
Like, how do you solve that? I have my viewpoint on how to solve those challenges.
Yeah.
Which are right. Antonia has her viewpoints,
which are wrong, clearly.
No, I'm just kidding. Like that, I think I'm right. I'm not actually saying I learned a lot from her, but I would say that's a lot of attention too.
So the friction is basically that neither of us can carry the other person's weaknesses there because we're doubled up on them. We're doubled up on each other's strengths, which is very cool too. It makes us that complex coordination Joel was talking about before. I think it helps with that, but it also means that we're playing hot potato with anything that's anything that's a closed loop, anything that's operations or something to that effect.
Like I don't know how to solve this, Richard. When we running our profiler training program, it'll be 6 months away, and the judges in our audience, our students, their judges, like, can you please tell me what time lunch will be on Thursday, like 6 months from now? And I'm like, what? How? Like, what in the world? Like, how would I even know that? I don't know. But judges want that information, right?
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that we're not like going to be good at, like knowing, be able to nail exactly. We can approximate it, but we're not going to hit it exactly. We'll probably be 15 minutes, before or after that.
Oh, that's like the nicest version of it. It's actually, there's a lot of other things too, like time schedules and how far out we should be pre-recorded for our podcast. And like, just all the little incidentals. Those are the things we have a tendency to have tension around, not because like one of us is better than the other one is arguing for that position, but because we're actually both not certain about it. We are deeply uncertain about all these things. And so we play hot potato with them. But I would say that considering that we, we're married, we work together, we kind of spend every waking minute in each other's presence, which is every once in a while, I'm like, this is a problem. We should be separated, or like at least for 10 minutes. But considering all of that, I would actually say we do unbelievably well and keep the knockdown, drag out fights to a minimum for the most part.
Usually.
That's cool. I think it's nice that you can work together so closely. I think a few couples can manage to do that. And it was a lovely moment a minute ago, actually, where you were praising Joel's extroverted thinking. And like, I don't know if is it ENFP preferences, Joel? Was it yours?
Yes.
So it's like, you were also fans of John Beebe's work and his the eternal child function, the puer. I just caught a little glimmer of that, the pride of when you were saying, yes, I can do lots of things really well, and I got a little smirk of pride that Joel had. You can watch that
right.
play. I just saw it there. It was lovely.
It made me smile.
That's right. All right, good job.
Yeah, so I think that's great. Like you said, you've got your strengths and your areas together. You're well aware of your challenges, and I think that's important to be kind to each other in those areas. When we start to go shadowy and demonize each other's weaknesses, it never goes well.
Yeah, I mean that does happen too.
Yeah,
like I'm not saying it doesn't. It's just we should be better at that than we are, but we're better than we would be if we didn't know it all. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I got it. Yeah, the knowledge helps for sure. But I mean, I think that's the thing with automatic like reactions. You can't always control them, but you can at least talk about them afterwards and go, yeah, that was my critical parent. I was a bit harsh. Sorry.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And that's a start, right? So let's get on to the topic. I wanted to talk about generations. We were talking before this that like you and I are Generation X, we're Gen Xers. What's the other two generations that we're talking about in your BAPT talk that are also part of this type story of the generations?
Yeah. So like you said, our age bracket is Generation X. And I mean, there's a whole school of thought around generational theory that I don't know if we have time to go into today. That's technical detail and all of that. So I'll just broad brush this for the sake of the conversation and this. But the generation that's older than us, that's really a significant generation, are the baby boomers. I think we all have a cultural reference point for baby boomers in that they're our parents, my parents' generation. They're aging, they're entering elderhood or in elderhood, and they have a life of experience of both professional experience, personal experience. Most people that had children might have grandchildren at this point. Like they're in that generational cycle of in an old tribe, they'd be the elders of the tribe dispensing wisdom. I think that's kind of the archetype that I see from the baby boomers as far as what they can offer. And then younger than us, Richard, you, me, and Antonia, are the millennials, the 20s and 30 something. And then just below them too. And I'm making a separation here, but there's also the Gen Z kind of crowd, the young, my children, your children are of another generation. I'm lumping them together almost as a big generation of young people, I'll call them, right? The youthful generation. There's a lot of differences and nuances based on the age and the particular generation, but in general, they're starting out. Like many of them are in the first parts of their careers. Maybe they've had a career for a while. They're looking to see what is actually my purpose, passion, mission in my life. And so there's a little bit of experience on the older side of it, but on the younger side of it, a lot of eagerness and youthfulness and excitement to start to engage with the world, maybe go to university or graduate university, start their life. And then we're sitting here in the middle. And Richard, you probably have a very similar experience to myself and Antonia. When I started, I was born in the late 1970s. So when I started my like middle school, out of elementary school into my middle school years, I was still using card catalogs at the library. Like I'd have to go in and open a card and find something in alphabetical order, look up a book or microfiche, and to write a paper. And then by the time my high school career ended, that changed. Like in the middle of me going to school, and I think this is a very unique situation for a lot of Gen Xers, computers started to come online as far as like indexing of like books and resources. And so by the end of my high school career and into my university time period, I'm now looking up things online. I'm searching through a digital card catalog, no longer going, I mean, the physical one's still there, but you can tell it's going to go away very soon in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And so this bridge we all experienced as a Gen X culture, a Gen X generation, I think we have a unique sense. We've got one foot in what I would call maybe the old guard, the old world of how life was up until the internet became such a prominent force to be reckoned with. But yet we do have a foot in the new world as well, because we had to adapt quickly while we were young to emerging technology. And so I think there's this bifurcation of kind of the old analog world versus the new digital world. And I think Gen Xers are right in the middle of that. I mean, people in their midlife right now are in the middle of that generation having had that experience. So I think as a generation, we're a bridge generation between two worlds, but also between two generational cohorts that are very connected to the way things work. So like the baby boomers are going to be more connected to that analog world, and the younger people are going to be more connected to the digital world. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know about the other worldview. And us in the middle, we have a sense of both directions. So that's kind of real broad brush how I see it from our perspective here as people in our 40s, as of the time of this recording.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So talking about worldviews, like, is there a noticeable difference between, say, the Boomer and Millennial, Gen X, Gen Z generations?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few. The first thing that pops up or comes to mind is that, and we got a taste of this as Gen Xers, but Boomers were raised and came of age and then started families in a time period that was still very modernist. Like, people had a single set of dictionaries that had the answer to your question, and there was single streams of news. Like there was still the Walter Cronkite phenomena where it's like in the United States, it's like one person delivered the news and that's how you knew what was going on.
Saying it was true or factual, right?
Right. And so with modernism, it's like these single strings of information that you can, sort of pit your sources against. And so it was very easy to have a standard. Now, whether or not it was empirically true or accurate kind of didn't matter. It was like that was where you got your information.
Yeah.
And millennials, like this happened in transition in our lifetime as Gen Xers. But by the time that millennials came of age, there was a very postmodern way of looking at things. There's now not one set of encyclopedias you find information about. There's like now every encyclopedia that was ever invented is now available on the internet. So you can go look for a piece of information, and now you have literally millions of hits coming back to you of different people's opinions on that. And so there was no longer like a single standard piece of information. Now it's all up to interpretation. Now it's like postmodernism in that ability to sort of play with reality and see outside of a modernist perspective. That bakes into one's brain a certain style of wiring. It completely alters a person's relationship to reality.
Yeah.
And so the things that are assumptive for one generation are not assumptions for another generation. And they're both assuming things about each other. And by the way, Gen Xers, like, the only reason why we're saying we can be a bridge is because we can be, not necessarily that we are. You can see that people in our generation have a tendency to go one direction or the other as well. But we do potentially have a foot in both, in both doors. So there's a lot of assumptions that people of these generations make, that they don't know that when they're using language, they're building their concepts, ideas on top of these assumptions that aren't the same assumptions. For example, not just modernism and postmodernism, but I think of, and we'll be talking about this in our talk, this idea of like type professionals versus type influencers. It's a big difference. Like in a time period of boomers, if you notice, like there's almost like a reluctance to talk about things like cognitive functions, because in that time period, a lot of Myers-Briggs application was in careers and businesses, and businesses didn't seem to want to have that depth of information. They wanted things that were more actionable and usable, like fast, like connections, you know, so it was more about 16 types, or it was dichotomies, or it was temperaments, or
interaction styles.
Yeah, interaction styles is a big one, right? Like, which is fantastic. It's all good stuff, and it's very actionable. It's very practical, and
usually for a corporate setting,
because it had to be
organizational application.
But there was like a shying away of functions. I can't remember whose book it was. Was it Otto Kruger's? There was somebody's book that basically said, I'm not really going to talk about functions because I don't think people can really understand them anyway. And so it was almost like a reluctance to go down that rabbit's hole. Now, when you flip over to millennials, that's all they want to talk about. They just want to get as intricate as possible. They want to get way down the rabbit's hole. They want to talk about all the little, like, is that introverted thinking or is that extroverted thinking? And how would I know? And blah, 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 right?
The analytic version versus the holistic
version.
Yeah.
Is that my point of least, resistance? Is that my trickster function? Is that the same thing? Right? Like, it's just all these intricacies, because they're not using it for necessarily a practical application. They're more using it for self-discovery, for identity, right? There's a big thing around, in a postmodern world, identities start to liquefy. Right. In a modernist world, you have a role, right? This is your role. This is what you do. And so you don't have to get so obsessed with identity, because that's a little, that's a little more, it's like, well, this is what I do. Like, tell me about yourself. Well, I'm a mother and I'm a blah, blah, blah. It's like all these roles come out. In a postmodern world, you lose that. Roles are no longer a part of your identity. And so now you have to find identity wherever you can get it. And you can see this, right? Identity politics, identity, blah, blah, blah. And so because of that, the system, like people's appetite for the system has changed into, what can I understand about myself and all these intricacies? The challenge is that it loses the application. It loses the practicality. It loses like that component that the modernist perspective was so good at solidifying, but then maybe missed people's appetite for those intricacies as well. On the other side, it's all theory, right?
Distinctions and theories.
Distinction and theory, but it's missing the practical application. So at a certain point, you're just pedantic and just arguing with people on the internet, right? You're just arguing with each other. The more modernist perspective, the more sort of boomer style, also adds a little bit of class, right? There's a professionalism of how we're going to communicate and interact with each other. On the influencer side, or the younger generation side, they have no problem having like flame battles with each other in their YouTube videos against each other. So like there's something that gets lost in interpretation when you become such a theory junkie that you forget that there's actual, knowledge and wisdom here through application. But at the same time, it's hard to really grasp that if an older generation is reluctant to start adding in these intricacies, because now it's like, oh, well, that's an old way of doing things. And we're now evolving the theory, not knowing they're actually not evolving. They're just discovering something, right? So I think the reason why it's so important to bridge these two worlds is so that we get both the practical, concrete, experiential, this is the rubber hitting the road. Wisdom. This is how it actually plays out. This is where the theory, like, I don't care if that's the rule. That's not how reality works, right? There's like limitations to that. And you can break some of the rules because that's reality, that's messy. And there's some of that absolutely needs to be infused into the theory junkie, all the intricacy, because now that's just going off the rails. And by the same token, I think that there is a lot to be said for adding some of that more flavor, all those specifics, all those technical aspects, layering it on top of what has been learned in like resources like Milo and all of that information and work that's been done primarily around 16 types. It's like it can sort of season and beautify and add even more understanding around all of that work. So I think that's why we think it's so important to bridge these two worlds, because I think that there's a real opportunity to as opposed to getting further and further away from Jung's concepts of like individuation, etc. I think there's a real opportunity to start baking some of that, like that truly life-changing component, if we can get these two sides to meet in the middle.
Okay, yeah. So we've got a sort of idea of like what these sides are like. I wonder if we can quantify it. I mean, I'm just thinking, there can't be more than between 50 and 100 visible type professionals who talk at conferences and things on a within the last few years, for instance. That's internationally, and there's only sort of 3 main conferences that I'm aware of, plus other smaller ones like happen in France and other places. And then, around that, members of APTs and people who aren't members but are like type professionals. I'm not sure how many thousands there would be. On the millennial Gen Z side, are we talking like audiences of millions potentially, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thousands of people kicking on their cameras to talk about type on YouTube.
Well, it's become keychained. It becomes a tchotchke in people's lives. When I say that, what I mean is, it's almost like, you ever have like a souvenir, you go on holiday and you get a souvenir from the place and you've got like a little representation of, like, if I went to Hawaii here in the United States, I might be like a little keychain with like a rainbow and a sunset on it, and it says Hawaii. It reminds me of my trip to Hawaii. A lot of younger people's relationship with their personality type almost feels like a keychain level holiday souvenir. Like, they might post it in their online profile. They might repost or generate like a little graphic with, my ENFP preferences mean that I've got these 5 characteristics, and they're wildly oversimplified, right? But they're like almost trading and passing around little bits of information, little snippets of type, sometimes very wildly inaccurate or just not very precise. Like, it's just too general.
And sometimes good though.
But sometimes good.
Sometimes calibrated.
But what it shows me is there's an eagerness, there's an openness, there's a sense of almost having access to this in more bite-sized chunks, but often not knowing what to really do with it. And so I think the other thing is younger people infusing this idea of, that's great, get excited about it. And when you say audience of millions, I think the reason why that triggered that thought for me, people passing that around, is that's where I see a lot of it. So people that are seriously talking about it, it'd be much like the type professionals. Like, there's a few YouTube channels and podcasts and online resources that would be analog to type professionals, maybe the old guard, I would call it, the older guard that's like going to conferences, speaking in a professional service. There's a lot of those online, but that's a smaller group. But there are potentially millions, hundreds of thousands or millions of these keychain level, where you're passing around kind of like, oh, I'm this type. Oh, cool. And like a lot of eagerness without a lot of depth or real understanding of what they're talking about.
Or anything to like connect it to.
Connect it to a real way. And so that's something we're seeing evolve right now. And then the other thing about younger generations, this happened, I talked to my 16-year-old son about this. This is really interesting. He told me the other day, he never expects a product or printed material to be correct produced by a company. He said, if I get an instruction manual, like I open a box to put something together, I get an instruction manual, I expect it to be wrong. I expect it to have mistakes that'll prevent me from being able to put that product together correctly. If I have a can of soda or something I'm drinking and there's an ingredient list and something's misspelled, I'd expect it to be misspelled. I expect things not to be accurate, to be broken, to be not working the first time. If I order something online, or I order a product or service or a written material, I expect it to have typos and not correct, like correct material.
Or to show up
with
DOA.
mistakes. And I said, wait, you don't expect, when you pay value for something, that you're getting a quality product back. I said, how is your mindset on this? He said, because nothing is. Like, everything is always in his mindset at 16. The world he's growing up in is iterative. In other words, something gets released and it wasn't right, so we add like a 2.0 version and we update it, like our computer software. Like, oh, there's something broke, I have to update the patch, I've got to update my software to
video
fix.
Game with bugs.
Yeah, and his video games all have like bugs and mistakes in them that he plays, and so he has got to update it to fix it, and it's a constant improvement process. This is a whole different way of thinking than like my parents' generation, who were like, we prep, we create the product, we get it all perfect, and then we release it into the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a different mentality from the young people to people that have been here before. The expectation is different, what they're putting out is different. Like, and it's something that I'm more the old guard, right? I think more in terms of like quality product, you look for typos, you refine it. But that's not how younger people are thinking. They're kind of like doing it as they go. I don't even know what I mean by that.
That like the entrepreneurial phrase,
like ship it.
Yeah, ship and like go fast and break things.
Yeah,
that's now gotten sort of infused into
like their expectations.
Sort of life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's not this dynamic where I have a challenge in my life. Let's say I've got a challenge with my spouse or my partner. I'm going to go ask an expert for their expert advice. They're going to give me accurate expert advice that I can apply in my life to go fix this or help this. Like, it's actually more, I'm going to go to my peers I'm going to ask what they've tried. This is the younger generations I'm talking about. I'm going to check in with them, and then maybe together we'll co-create or we'll co-explore or generate, maybe through conversation. If you notice, young people often will gather lots of people online to talk about type in larger groups, like panels and things. And so let's discover this together. Let's not trust the experts of the system that came before. It can't be trusted. It's not going to be trustworthy. Like my son, like I can't trust that good stuff's going to come from that. I have to somehow be responsible and do this for myself and figure this out on my own, which leads it to feel, from my perspective, I don't think this is true, but it almost feels like the viewpoint is the world started the day I was born. Like everything that came before I was born is illegitimate. I don't have to look at it. I have to figure all this out in my own life. And so the world started the moment I was born. And that's the viewpoint I'm coming from. Again, I'm overgeneralizing from younger's perspective, but this is the sense I'm getting from younger people. This is how they see things. Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah, I'm wondering as well whether it's even compounded in the US where you are.
Possibly.
You know, with the medical system and the fact that, you know, it can be so costly and difficult to access some things, the right kind of care if you don't have it, that people have to become their own medical experts to try and figure out what's going on. I mean,
Possibly.
is that part of that kind of whole mindset where people have had to become the expert? So what does that mean about their attitude towards trained actual experts? You know, what is it, an anti-expert mindset or something?
It certainly is the same deference they used to give.
Yeah.
I think that's the big takeaway.
Well, and it means that you have to amp up your authenticity. Like you have to first be a person. And this is why influencers and personalities become such a, you know, there's a lot of cult of personalities, because the first thing is I need to know that you're a person, not a company, right? You're not the establishment. And I need to know, because you're a person and authentic, it means that you're going to share your experiences and what has worked and what hasn't worked, as opposed to give like top level expertise. And then I expect you to also demonstrate it. I want you to walk through and show me the math. And I think this is one of the reasons why things like type has become so much, you know, cognitive function specific and intricate, is because they want the math of all of it. And then they want to be able to take the math and then use it for their own purposes and personalize it to themselves. And so the other component to this, or another node in the system of all of this, is how tailored our lives have gotten to our experiences. Like in the past, you grew up, if people wanted to watch content together as a family, there was like one television, and there were like 5 or 6 channels tops, or 4, you know, in earlier days, and everybody had to watch this one show at this one time, and if you missed it, too bad. But now you'll see entire families like on their phones or on their devices, or somebody's playing a video game over here and somebody's watching a show over here and somebody's watching TikTok over here or whatever. Fragmented. And they're all like in the same room, but none of them are doing the same activity together. They're all tailoring their experience to what they want to have, or what they want. And so there's an expectation that, no, just give me the things that I need in order to tailor my experience to me. And if I'm going to follow you as somebody who's influencing me, then I need to know, like, give me all the math, give me all the specifics, help me understand what your experience was, what your lived experience was, and then I'll take what I want to take from it, and then I'll tailor it to me. And it's a totally different way of seeing things. And I think because of that hyper tailoring, it means that you can't make any assumptions that people will take your word for anything. You can't make any assumptions of like what it is that you want. You can't like tailor the product for them. I mean, there is a little bit of that. There's like, you know, like there are those services that, you know, try to put together like a box and they send it out to everybody, and it's like, these are the products you get in this box. But that's actually more about trying things out and deciding what you like for the future, so you can tailor experience into the future. But it's like it's not because like, oh, thank you for giving me this cool experience, right? It's more like, oh, I liked that, but I didn't like that, so now I know that I want to be able to buy more of that product. So it's hyper tailoring. It's very show me all the math so that I can figure out what I want for myself. And then on top of that, there's this assumption that people are not going to give quality things. And so I have to kind of figure this all out for myself. And I'm going to do that with my peer group by talking about all these things and sort of piecing it all together collaboratively. And I think that I think it's such a profoundly different way of looking at things, that the value that older generations have in that, like, brass tacks, rubber hits the road. This is the experiments that we've done. This is what we've learned from it. Here's the practical application of it. It's like, how do you take that and kind of weave it into all of that, right?
Yeah.
Like that's such a fast iterative process. The reason why they like knowledge and information so much is because knowledge and information is fast, right? Like knowledge and wisdom, application and learning lessons, that's slow, right? That is like a slow process that you learn over time, right? It's like, oh, I had to do this thing. It took me this amount of time. Then I had to like go back and learn from all of my mistakes. And then I had to emotionally deal with the fact that I made a bunch of mistakes. And now I've got the wisdom and the learning from it. That is that's like the Titanic, right? As opposed to just fast iterative information, go, 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 go. And then we can just keep iterating on that. It's like, how do you kind of, in this really fast hamster wheel of information and data, how do you like kind of shove in this message and then also apply it, right? Do something with it, like have it be concrete, experiential. It's so hard to get that message in there because that slows everything down. But it's intended to slow things down, right? That's the point of it, is that if you just get in this like hamster wheel of theory,
yeah,
good for you. I'm glad you're talking about functions all the time. I'm sure that that's been very rewarding, but it's not going to do anything for your life, which is actually something that has to be lived. So it's a challenge to marry these two worlds, I think, because of part of it is just the speed.
Yeah. So if you were to dream an extroverted, intuitive dream about what this ideal future could be like, that blended the worlds that we're talking about, what might it be like?
It's a good question. What would the world be like if people that are wired this way maybe had other access points? Okay, so I think I'll take a first stab at it, unless you have something to go with.
Yeah, go for it.
I think the world so it almost sounds like we're talking about this negatively, first of all. Like, oh, this is a bad thing. Younger generations are wrong. They should do it my way or the way I know.
That's right. Only we know what's going on as Gen Xers.
And there is some frustration because I've learned to be a certain way in life. And now it feels like, to me, the world's changing on me. Like, I just figured it out. Why are you changing? Like, there's going to be some frustration. So I just want to make sure I speak to that there's probably some frustration for myself and people even older than me. The world's changing. There's not as much deference to that. But I do see some excitement and eagerness for younger people that are they want to lean forward and they want to make these like concepts around personality type, personal growth, access points to all of this. They really want to make it real to them and applicable. And I think that I would love to see that encouraged, because as we talk about modernism breaking down and the generations that represent modernism, I think the Gen X generation, yours, mine, and Antonia's, Richard's generation, I think we're the last generation to have a fully immersed experience of modernism. There's a few millennials that have a taste of it, but we're the last. It's going to be fully postmodern from now forward. And so as the institutions we're used to, the religious institutions, cultural institutions, I mean, even in the UK where you're at, like your symbolic institution of the king and queen is kind of, from our perspective in America, it's a little bit, it's fraying a little bit now the queen has passed away.
Yeah.
It's like it's up for reevaluation. Like, do we still want that institution? So we're reevaluating all of our institutions. And unfortunately, a lot of people, generations have leaned in, and our identity, like Antonia mentioned earlier, we've really relied on that to give us a sense of self. So I think our wish for people is that we realize just how much of a ballast, understanding how our cognition is wired, how we show up as individuals to the world. This can be a new ballast that can help us navigate that transition moment as these institutions start to break down, whether we want them to or not. It's happening. There's something we can have as a sense of, okay, I have a sense of myself. I know who I am, how I show up to the world, to be able to navigate that space. So I think that's really our wish, is that young people will see this as something they can use as a tool to help navigate uncertain and uncharted territory. And it's only going to get more uncertain and more uncharted. Like artificial intelligence right now, at the time of this recording, it's just starting. I'm sure 5 years from now, I'll be laughing at myself mentioning it because we'll see how it actually plays out. But it's going to come fast. It's going to change everything. It's like the invention of agriculture. It's going to shift the world in such a way, even more than the invention of the internet, I think. And it's going to change like literally how we experience reality. We have no idea as humans how that's going to happen. We better have a pretty good sense of who we are and how we're wired and how we're showing up to navigate that space, or we're going to be victims of just whatever comes our way. We're going to be like untethered floating entities to the world. So I think that's my personal view or wish for younger generations, to see this as something that can help them in those uncertain moments and uncertain times.
Okay, so it's like grounding, a ballast of self-awareness, perhaps in in a crazy futuristic AI world.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I wrote that down too as you were talking, is AI, and then I put like a little arrow to the word transmodernism. Now I know that there's like, I think somebody co-opted the term transmodernism and it has like a very specific definition or meaning someplace, but I just think of it as like whatever comes after postmodernism. And so I don't think postmodernism itself is going to be like a forever thing. In fact, I think it's going to be very quickly taken over by whatever comes next. And I think AI is going to be a big part of that. So the world is going to change in ways that are like sort of blindingly fast. And so I'm not introverted intuition. I'm extroverted intuition, which means that whenever I start thinking about the future and running a simulation as to how it's probably going to happen, my first function always goes, yeah, but you can't know that because there's some disruptive technology that's going to derail all of it. And so then I just like, at a certain point, I just stop thinking about it. But I do have a sense of like personally, as Joel was talking about this idea of identity, that we're losing the things that we used to use to solidify our identities, these roles and these assumptions, like everything's sort of up for grabs. And identity is a big topic because of it, I think. And my fear, and this is more, I mean, we've been talking functions this whole time, so I'm just giving myself permission to talk functions. But the introverted sensing part of me that understands the importance of legacy, that understands the importance of where we've come, understands the importance of stewarding information that needs to be passed from generation to generation, and wanting to honor that part of who I am as well.
Not just information, but wisdom.
Yes.
Wisdom.
There is the thing that studying Jung did for me is made me understand that this tool that has been used as a business application, which is fantastic, a personal development application, which is fantastic, and all these different ways that it can be seen, really sort of immersing myself in Jung's work over the last so many years, I've realized it's actually a psycho-spiritual tool. There's a deep sense of spirituality in Jung's works. And I know that a lot of times people shy away from that concept because they want to keep it as scientific as possible. But if you want science, don't stick with Jung. Okay. Like Jung he was a genius. He was an artist. He was a spiritualist, and he was a psychonaut, right? Like he was all of those things. And the reason why his work is going to, I think, is going to live for a long time is because he tapped into things that weren't the science of the time necessarily, right? Like it's not just limited to that, although there is some of that too. But I think that his work is psycho-spiritual. And for me, there's almost like a sense of stewardship of passing the torch. Like I get to, in this moment of the timeline, if I do it well, I get to remind people of those psycho-spiritual roots, even if I'm smuggling it in 16 types, and this is what an INTP is like, and this is what an ESFP is like, and that coloring book version of it. It's like, but I also get to smuggle in these deep, rich, psycho-spiritual understandings as I'm understanding them. Like, I mean, I understand them more and more every day. And I know that I'm like at the very beginning, but I can be a steward of that information that can get passed from me to whatever's the next generation. And as long as that information lives, as long as somebody is the torchbearer, as long as somebody is keeping, like in the past, we used to call it arcane knowledge, and it was behind walled gardens, and you had to be an acolyte, and you had to do certain things in order to gain access to that information. And it's like, why would this information be any different, right? So the masses can use it however they want to, but if we can steward this really important psycho-spiritual depth that has real value to people who go down that rabbit's hole, and if we can attract as many people as humanly possible to want that aspect of it so that they can be the torchbearers next, then it's just like the information has to live. Like it doesn't matter who the carrier is. It doesn't matter how it works. It doesn't matter like if somebody's like arguing over pedantic functions or whatever. As long as there are some people who are actually living through this concept of individuation, then I think into the future, like we always have this information available if somebody when somebody needs it.
Yeah.
And I think it's less about what can the future look like and can we save the world with this information than it is like, can we make sure to preserve it? Can we make sure that we pass it to the next generation and that they understand the original intent of it? Because I think it's actually, I think it's deeper than just type and identity. I think there's something important to really steward in all of this.
Wow, it's quite a big mission. I mean, it does sound like a kind of modern day crusade, almost like digital crusade.
Yeah.
You know, and I I get what you're saying. I mean, for me, like, what is psychology and spirituality? Are they different? Or are they just the same thing? Is spirituality more like our experiential aspects of psychology that we can only have as a first person, that kind of some of that magic that you lose when you try to objectify it? Perhaps that's it. It's that, for me, that kind of experiential aspect. And yeah, and Jung wasn't afraid to go there. Whatever we experienced was fair game for him, which, I think to his credit.
Yeah.
So, I think we're going to have to wrap up now, unfortunately, because we've lasted for a whole hour of this really interesting discussion.
We've ruined your interview, Richard. We went to this whole psycho-spiritual place and we didn't talk about generations as much, but
well, I think we got the main points of the generations, and we gave enough of a taster so that people might want to come along and hear the full thing at the BAPT conference. It's an online conference, so people can join from anywhere in the world. Try to make it friendly to different time zones as well. So we're staying up late here in the UK to allow more kind of people in the US to join. Yeah, so just check it out, bapt.org.uk. That's our website, so you can have a look at that. And there's 2 whole days of talks by a whole range of experts in the field. Joel and Antonia are talking there from Personality Hacker. What is your website if people want to hear more of you guys? Where do they go?
You can easily just find us at personalityhacker.com. That's the best place to start. And I just want to say thank you, Richard, for inviting us. We really do believe in what BAPT is doing. And I think it's more, some of the things we've been talking about highlight that the conference you're going to be hosting, that we're going to be a part of, it's so critical. And so if you're a young person right now watching this recording, my recommendation is you get a ticket to come to this. There are people that have been working with personality types for decades that have wisdom to share with you. As a young person, maybe you want to create content, maybe you want to be part of a new guard that's emerging that can help carry some of these ideas forward. Come connect to a community of wise people that have experience that you can be a part of, learn from, be mentored by. So someday maybe you're the person that's dispensing the wisdom. So I just want to encourage people that we can't be more excited about what you're doing for BAPT and what's happening. And I just really hope a lot of people come and join this experience. I think it's more needed now than ever.
Yep.
So thank you.
Lovely. Thanks a lot. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanks again for joining us, and take care. All right.